From the flint tools of Neanderthal man to the devastating weapons of modern warfare, war has been an indisputable progress in human history. Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 04, Episode 15, where we confront the enduring question of on war from Will Durant's poignant reflections in Fallen Leaves. Today, we're embarking on a truly profound deep dive into a topic as old as humanity itself, the nature and persistence of conflict. Our guide for this journey is the remarkable historian and philosopher Will Durant, specifically his compelling and often unsettling insights from Fallen Leaves.
Yeah, unsettling is definitely a good word for some of it.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack his comprehensive, multifaceted analysis of war, tracing its ancient primal origins, dissecting its fundamental, persistent causes, and ultimately grappling with its profound implications for humanity, all while exploring the ever-elusive search for peace.
It's a huge undertaking.
It is. It's a vast, challenging subject, often uncomfortable in its honesty, but absolutely essential, I think, for understanding ourselves, our history, and the turbulent world we inhabit. So, prepare for a journey into some truly insightful and sometimes stark observations that might reshape how you view human progress itself.
It's a powerful and deeply thought-provoking undertaking, you're right. And Durant, he wastes absolutely no time in setting that provocative tone right from the very outset. He immediately thrusts us into a stark comparison that really forces us to confront a very uncomfortable truth about the trajectory of human development.
And it truly is stark. Durant opens his reflection by taking us back to 1830, to a seemingly unassuming moment in the valley of the Somme in France. There, a French customs official, Jacques Boucher de Crèvecoeur de Perthes, unearthed these strange, ancient flint implements. They quickly became known as coups de poing, which translates quite literally to blows of the fist.
Right, fist blows. Kind of gives you a visceral image.
It does. Try to picture them in your mind. One end rounded and smooth, perfectly crafted for grasping. The other sharply pointed for what Durant Riley calls persuasion.
Persuasion, yeah.
These were the primary weapons used by Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon men some 50,000 years ago. More than just tools, these were the crude instruments by which these ancient humans from what we now call Germany and France fought for mastery of the continent.
Okay.
And after a day of what Durant describes as lusty battle, they might have left perhaps a score of dead on the field. Think about that scale.
Yeah.
20 lives, perhaps, lost in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle for survival.
It's a vivid, almost primal image, isn't it? A testament to the earliest, most basic form of organized conflict. And then Durant delivers the chilling, gut-wrenching contrast that truly defines his opening argument.
And the irony is just palpable. It's the very same valley, mind you, the Somme, a name synonymous with, unimaginable slaughter in the 20th century.
Right. A name that evokes so much horror.
Yeah. But this time, it's not ancient men with flints. It's modern Germans and modern Frenchmen, locked in the horrific embrace of the First and Second World Wars. The tools. Not simple flint coup de poing, but what Durant calls magnificent tools of death.
Magnificent. Such a loaded word there.
Exactly. And the result? These magnificent tools killed 10,000 men in a single day. The scale of destruction, the efficiency of annihilation had not just increased, it had exploded exponentially.
Wow.
And that's precisely where Durant drops his bombshell, the observation that hangs over everything else. The art that has made the most indisputable progress is the art of war.
That statement is profoundly provocative because when we typically think about progress, our minds instinctively go towards notions of improvement, right? Of betterment, advancements that uplift humanity, make life easier, safer, more fulfilling.
Sure, yeah. That's the usual meaning.
But Durant is highlighting progress in its chillingly literal, purely mechanical sense. A terrifying increase in efficiency, an exponential growth in scale, and an almost horrifying sophistication in technology. He's emphatically not talking about moral progress or societal betterment.
No, definitely not.
No, he's referring to an undeniable, systematic refinement in the ability to destroy, to inflict maximum casualties with maximum speed. When you place those ancient flints side by side with modern artillery, machine guns, chemical weapons, air power, where you see a direct, undeniable line showing our increasing, almost chilling mastery over the mechanics of annihilation.
It's hard to argue with that specific point, the sheer technical advancement.
Right. And the question it forces us to confront, to really grapple with is, what does it truly mean for humanity when the most advanced, the most undeniably progressive art form we possess, the one we have perfected above all others, is the art of killing each other? What does that singular fact, that relentless efficiency and destruction say about our species, about our priorities, about our very nature? It truly makes you pause and consider the implications for our future, doesn't it?
It certainly makes you pause and reflect on where our ingenuity often leads us, and the profound, often uncomfortable ironies of human advancement. And this stark opening, this unflinching confrontation with our destructive capabilities, leads directly into Durant's sweeping historical panorama of conflict. It's a chronicle that is, frankly, overwhelming in its sheer scope, a relentless march through the ages. He states with a weary yet resolute tone that 500 centuries, 2,000 generations have struggled for that terrain in a calendar of wars whose beginning is as obscure as its end. He really paints a picture of a relentless, unbroken, and seemingly inescapable chronicle of strife.
He does, and he doesn't shy away from the brutality of it at all. He takes us on an exhaustive whirlwind tour through history, detailing this ceaseless struggle. He begins with what he calls the occasional brawls and raids of normally peaceful savages,
Okay.
which quickly escalated into the sanguinary annals of Egypt, Sumer, Babylonia, and Assyria, a bloody testament to early empire building. Then he transports us to the untiring fratricide of Greek city-states, where even the birthplace of philosophy and democracy was plagued by internal, often brutal conflict.
Right, the Peloponnesian War and all that.
Exactly. From there is the relentless conquests of Alexander and Caesar, carving out vast empires through sheer military might, and the triumphs of imperial Rome, built on the subjugation of countless peoples. We then witness the brutal wars of expanding Islam, the devastating slaughters of Mongol hordes, and that horrifying, almost mythical image of Tamerlane's Pyramid of Skulls, a chilling monument to utter devastation. And that's just the ancient and medieval worlds.
Right. It's already exhausting. And he then plunges us into the more recent past with a litany of conflicts that define centuries. The Hundred Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, the 30 Years' War, which alone devastated Central Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War.
It just keeps going.
And then the monumental, often bloody revolutions. The English, American, French, and Russian. Not to mention the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, the Spanish-American War, the Russo-Japanese War, the First World War, and the Second World War. It's an absolutely exhausting list, isn't it? A seemingly endless parade of destruction, a relentless, unbroken chain of human suffering and violence spanning millennia.
And that precisely is the powerful and deeply pessimistic point of this pessimistic moment perspective that Durant so vividly presents. He suggests that this seemingly endless lust of conflicts, this continuous narrative of bloodshed and conquest, appears to be the main and bloody current of history.
Yeah, that's the impression you get.
In such moments, when you're immersed in this grim parade of battles, he observes that all the achievements of civilization, all the illumination of literature and art, all the tenderness of women and the chivalry of men are but graceful incidents on the bank, helpless to change the course or character of the stream.
Wow. That's bleak. Like, civilization is just window dressing on the river of war.
It's a profoundly dark and almost deterministic view, implying that for all our advancements, for all our aspirations for beauty and peace, conflict remains the dominant, unyielding force in human affairs, dwarfing everything else. It truly makes you consider the sheer relentless scale and persistence of conflict throughout our entire existence. It almost begs the question, how much of what we call history is just the story of one group fighting another? How much of the human story has been fundamentally defined by this struggle?
But then, just when you're sinking into that pessimistic abyss, just when you feel that human history is nothing but a ceaseless march of war, Durant, in a classic move, he pulls us out, challenging that very exaggeration of war's omnipresent role.
Right, he offers a counterpoint.
He states quite pointedly that such a chronicle exaggerates, without doubt, the role of war in the record of our race. He then offers a fascinating insight into why chroniclers often deform the past into a shambles. It's because strife is dramatic. It's inherently exciting and memorable.
It grabs the headlines, so to speak.
Exactly. To most of our historians, he observes, peaceful generations appear to have no history. So historians, he argues, leap from battle to battle and unwittingly deform the past into a shambles. It's a truly powerful point about how we construct our historical narratives, how the very act of recording history can inadvertently create a bias towards conflict.
It is, and it's a vital, often overlooked correction. Durant reminds us that in our saner moments, those times when we step back from the dramatic accounts of war, we must recognize that lucid intervals of peace far outweigh in any nation's story the mad seizures of war.
Okay, so peace is actually the norm, statistically speaking.
That's what he's suggesting. He emphasizes that the true history of civilization, the quiet, cumulative development of law and morals, science and invention, religion and philosophy, letters and the arts, this vast, slow, transformative process runs like hidden gold in the river of time.
Hidden gold. I like that metaphor.
It's a crucial, almost redemptive shift in perspective. It means that while war might be the loud, dramatic narrative we often focus on, the vast, quiet, painstaking, cumulative progress of human civilization, the long periods of sustained peace and cultural advancement, are the real, enduring legacy. They are the bedrock upon which any human flourishing is built.
So if war is the visible, turbulent current, violent and undeniable, then peace and progress are the hidden gold flowing silently beneath, shaping everything, nurturing growth, but often overlooked precisely because they aren't as loud, as dramatic, or as immediately catastrophic.
Exactly. Like the steady, incremental development of agricultural techniques over centuries that fed populations and allowed for cities to grow, or the patient refinement of legal systems that allowed complex societies to function. These unsung advancements, often overshadowed by the grand narratives of battles and empires, are the true markers of our enduring civilization.
That makes sense. It's the stuff that happens between the dramatic events.
Precisely. And it truly challenges us to think critically about how our focus on conflict shapes our understanding of history. What incredible advancements, what innovations, what quiet triumphs of the human spirit do we consistently miss by constantly looking for the next battle, the next empire to fall, the next dramatic clash? It encourages us to actively seek out and appreciate the long, slow, often undramatic arc of human development that happens between the wars, the periods when humanity truly builds and creates. It's where so much of what we value truly originates.
Which brings us to the core haunting question that arises from this historical panorama. Why has war always been such a pervasive element of the human story? And, perhaps even more unsettling, will it always be? Durant doesn't just chronicle, he dives deep into the fundamental causes, starting right within us, at the level of the individual. He says with profound insight, the basic causes are in ourselves, for the state is the soul of man enlarged under the microscope of history.
That's a key line, a fascinating, almost unsettling premise, suggesting that national behavior, the grand geopolitical struggles, are just human behavior writ large, magnified for observation.
So nations act like big, complicated people.
In a way, yeah. And it's a brilliant conceptual leap. He then breaks it down into what he identifies as the 5 major instincts of mankind that he believes are the ultimate underlying sources of war: acquisition, mating, fighting, action, and association. If we can truly understand these fundamental, deeply wired human drives, he argues, we can begin to grasp why groups, nations, and civilizations behave the way they do on the global stage. It suggests a deeply deterministic, almost biological route to conflict.
Okay, let's break those down. Let's start with the instinct of acquisition, or what we commonly call greed. How does Durant connect that primal urge to the very origins of war itself?
He paints a truly vivid, almost visceral picture of prehistoric humanity. For thousands, perhaps millions of years, he explains, men were uncertain of their food supply. They hadn't yet harnessed agriculture. They were nomadic hunters and gatherers, utterly dependent on the precarious hunt, on the vagaries of nature.
Right. Life was tough, constantly on the edge.
Exactly. And when they finally made a kill, what was their response? They would gorge themselves to their cubic capacity with the raw flesh and the warm gore, right on the spot. Why such frenzied consumption? Because how could they tell when they might eat again?
Makes sense. Feast or famine.
This primal existential insecurity, this constant threat of starvation, he argues, is the fundamental root of greed. Greed, he says, is eating or hoarding for the future. Wealth is originally a hedge against starvation. So if you follow that logic, if you strip away all the layers of civilization and moralizing, well, war is at first a raid for food. It's a simple, brutal, and terrifyingly logical conclusion.
That's a truly profound and somewhat unsettling idea. That what we consider a vice today, greed, possessiveness, was once not just acceptable, but a necessity for human survival.
Right.
It flips our moral framework on its head.
It absolutely does. Durant provocatively states, perhaps all vices were once virtues, indispensable in the struggle for existence. They became vices only in the degree to which social order and increasing security rendered them unnecessary for survival.
Wow. So things like chasing, killing, hoarding.
Think about that. The impulses to chase, to kill, to grasp, to overeat, to hoard, these were not moral failings. For 100 millennia, they were vital adaptive behaviors selected for and bred into the race through countless generations.
Okay.
He then goes on to argue that no laws or morals or ideals, but only centuries of security can mitigate or destroy these deeply ingrained acquisitive and possessive impulses. It's a very long-term, almost geological view of human psychology, suggesting that our fundamental drives are incredibly resistant to short-term moral or legal interventions.
That's a sobering thought about how deep these things run.
And just to briefly touch on the mating instinct, Durant acknowledges that while the desire for mates and parental love shapes half of private human history, it hasn't often been a direct primary cause of large-scale warfare.
Like the Trojan War wasn't really about Helen.
Well, he cites the famous rape of the Sabine women as an example often attributed to romantic or sexual motives, but he quickly clarifies that even that was likely the amorous result of a conflict for land and food, not pure amorous intent. So even there, the drive for resources, for acquisition, was likely the underlying, more dominant driver.
Okay, so acquisition, the need for resources, is fundamental. What about the fighting instinct itself? How does that develop beyond simply needing to eat or find a mate?
Well, the fighting instinct enters more obviously into the analysis, directly leading to organized aggression. Nature, Durant observes, develops it vigorously as an aid in getting food or mates. It inherently arms every animal with organs of offense and defense, and even lends the physically weaker species the advantages of cunning and association.
Like pack hunting or camouflage.
Exactly. Crucially, from an evolutionary perspective, since the groups that survived and thrived were generally those that excelled not only in food getting and mate getting, but also in fighting and defending themselves, these instincts have been selected and intensified through the generations.
Survival of the fittest fighters, in a sense.
Right. This relentless selection process over millennia has caused these core drives to blossom into 100 secondary forms of acquisition, venery, which is the pursuit of sexual gratification, and strife. It's the very mechanism of survival that has hardwired conflict into us.
And this fighting instinct, as it scales up from the individual to the collective, eventually becomes what Durant calls the lust for power. This feels like a very modern yet timeless concept.
It truly is. Just as the primal quest for food expanded into the ambition to amass vast fortunes and resources, the fundamental fighting instinct, when it affects individuals and groups, has swelled into the lust for power and the waging of war.
So it starts small but grows.
For most ordinary people, this lust for power, this drive to achieve and exert influence, is a useful stimulus to ambition and creation, propelling them to build and innovate. But Durant warns, in exceptional individuals, those who rise to positions of immense influence, it can become a dangerous disease, a cancer of the soul.
A cancer of the soul. Strong words.
Yeah. This unchecked ambition drives them to fight 1,000 battles, usually by proxy, through the lives and sacrifices of others. He even mentions the philosopher Nietzsche, who, despite being physically sickly and disqualified from military service, quote, thrilled at the sight and sound of cavalry galloping along a Frankfurt street, and at once composed a paean in honor of war and the will to power. It's a powerful illustration of how deeply ingrained this drive can be, how it can possess individuals, even those physically removed from the direct violence of the battlefield. It's less about a physical fight and more about a psychological, almost spiritual drive to dominate.
Fascinating how deeply these impulses are wired into us, affecting both our individual desires and our collective actions. And then there's the instinctive action, which Durant briefly notes as a love of adventure or escape from relatives or routine, a basic human need for engagement, kind of restlessness.
Yeah, a bit like that.
But what about the instinct of association, which on the surface sounds far more benign, even positive? How does that instinct, our fundamental need for community, paradoxically lead to war?
That's where the complex idea of patriotism and its darker side comes into play. Durant explains that men naturally fear solitude and naturally seek the protection of numbers. This inherent human need leads to the formation of societies where people can live peaceably, where knowledge and goods can be accumulated, where families can thrive, and where faith can be practiced.
Okay, that sounds good. Building communities.
It is good, but over time, our self-love, our ego, this primal attachment to ourselves, overflows to include our immediate surroundings. Our family, our homes, our possessions, our beloved institutions, and even our shared faith and cultural heritage. This creates a powerful, often fierce, emotional attachment for the nation and the civilization of which these are constituent parts.
So love of self extends to love of group?
Exactly. And it's at this point, when any of these cherished elements, our group, our way of life, our national identity, are perceived as threatened, that Our instinct of pugnacity is aroused to the limit demanded by the natural cowardice of mankind. In other words, our innate desire to protect ourselves extends to protecting our group, and that protection can quickly turn to aggression.
So it's a protective instinct extended to the group, becoming a collective will to defend against perceived threats. It's the ultimate expression of tribalism, really.
Exactly. Durant states quite clearly that in a divided and lawless world, such patriotism is reasonable and necessary, for without it the group could not survive, and the individual could not survive without the group. He's not condemning patriotism outright. He's acknowledging its essential, primal role in group cohesion and survival. But he's also highlighting how that very cohesion, that powerful sense of belonging and loyalty, can become a potent source of conflict when one group's self-preservation clashes with another's. It explains why appeals to national pride or perceived threats to the homeland can so powerfully galvanize populations towards war.
Okay, so those are the individual psychological roots, these deeply ingrained instincts that form the bedrock of our species. But then Durant scales this up to the group level, doesn't he? How do these biological forces, these shared instincts, manifest on a larger national scale, contributing to the inevitability of conflict?
Yes, he states that these individual instincts, when considered in their mass, become powerful biological sources of war. The group itself, he argues, operates with a collective will and set of drives, much like an individual. The group, he suggests, as well as the individual, can be hungry or angry, ambitious or proud. The group, too, must struggle for existence and be eliminated or survive.
So the group takes on a life of its own.
Pretty much. One of the most critical biological forces at play, driving this group-level struggle, is what he calls the protective fertility of organisms. This is the natural tendency of all living things to reproduce, often beyond the immediately available resources. This inevitably leads to a situation where organisms soon multiplies mouths beyond the local food supply.
Malthus, basically. Population outstripping resources.
Exactly. This hunger of the parts, like in a human body, becomes the hunger of the whole. A collective national hunger leading species to war against species and group against group for lands or waters that may give more support to abounding life. He even notes that Euripides, over 2,000 years ago, attributed the Trojan War to the rapid multiplication of the Greeks, illustrating this ancient understanding of population pressure as a root cause of conflict. It's a fundamental Malthusian perspective applied to international relations.
So more people, less food, more fighting. A simple, brutal equation. And that group hunger then directly begets what he calls group pugnacity, the collective urge to fight.
Exactly. And just as in individuals, where fighting instincts lead to physical development, pugnacity develops in the group. Organs of protection and attack. In the context of a nation or a collective, these are called armament.
Weapons, armies, defenses.
Right. And here's where it gets truly fascinating and deeply relevant to our modern world. When these armaments become powerful, when a nation invests heavily in its military strength, they may themselves, like the boy's consciousness of his biceps, become a secondary source of war.
Ah, the arms race dynamic. Having the weapons makes you want to use them, or at least makes others nervous.
Precisely. The very tools designed for defense, for deterrence, for safeguarding national interests can paradoxically become an incentive for offense, a temptation to exert power, or a perceived threat by others, leading to an arms race that escalates tensions. Durant concludes this section with a fundamental, perhaps disheartening truth. Struggle is inevitable, and competition is the trait of life. It's a very Darwinian, almost biological view of national existence, suggesting that conflict is not an aberration, but an inherent part of the struggle for survival.
Okay, so we've gone from the core human instincts and biological imperatives to these deep-seated group-level dynamics, illustrating the fundamental human and natural drivers of conflict. But then Durant moves from these ultimate origins to what he calls the proximate causes of war, the economic and political drivers that are often what superficial analysis so readily contents itself with.
Right, the more obvious stuff.
But which he shows are simply extensions of those deeper roots. Let's delve into those. What are the basic economic causes he identifies?
The primary economic cause Durant identifies, which echoes the instinct of acquisition, is rivalry for land.
Yeah.
This isn't just about territory for its own sake, but land to receive a designedly expanding population, a place for burgeoning numbers to live and thrive.
Room to grow.
Exactly. It's also land to provide material resources, the raw materials necessary for a nation's sustenance and growth, from fertile soil to mineral wealth. And finally, land to open up new subjects to conscription and taxation, expanding the pool of manpower and revenue for the state. It's about the fundamental needs and expansionary drive of a growing nation.
And he gives very specific, powerful historical examples for this, doesn't he? Showing how this plays out across civilizations.
He certainly does, underscoring its universality. He points to how the ancient Greeks, facing limited arable land and a growing population, spread through the Aegean, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean, to Byzantium, Ephesus, Alexandria, Syracuse, Naples, Marseille, and Spain. This wasn't merely exploration, it was a demographic and economic imperative.
They needed more space, more resources.
Similarly, he notes how the English spread through the world in the last 2 centuries, building a vast empire driven by trade and resources. And even how the Americans are spreading now, a reflection on 20th century American expansion and influence. It's a recurring pattern throughout history, driven by this fundamental need for resources, space, and a wider sphere of influence to sustain a growing population.
But then the Industrial Revolution comes along, fundamentally changing the global economic landscape and amplifying everything. How does that monumental shift magnify these standard provocations to conquest and make economic rivalry even more acute?
This is where Durant's economic analysis becomes particularly modern and chillingly prescient. He explains that to wage war successfully in the industrial age, a modern nation must be wealthy. And to be wealthy, it must develop industry. This creates a complex chain of dependencies.
Okay, makes sense. War needs money, money needs industry.
Right. To maintain that industry, in most cases, a nation must import food, fuel, and raw materials, things like oil, iron ore, cotton, or grain. To pay for these essential imports, it must export manufactured goods to other nations. And to successfully sell these manufactured goods, it must find foreign markets.
The whole cycle of global trade.
Exactly. And this leads to a relentless competition. To win and maintain those markets, a nation must undersell its competitors or wage foreign war. It's a vicious cycle where economic necessity directly fuels military expansion and aggression. As Durant succinctly states, a nation will make war for any of the goods it considers vital, or for control of the routes by which they must come. It's an economic imperative that becomes a military one.
This sounds incredibly familiar, echoing many modern geopolitical struggles for resources and trade routes. What specific historical illustrations does he provide for this industrial-era economic warfare?
He provides several vivid and poignant examples that truly bring this analysis to life. He notes that Greece fought for control of the Aegean, the Hellespont, and the Black Sea because it was dependent upon Russian grain. A clear example of controlling vital food supply routes.
Control the choke points.
Precisely. Similarly, Rome had to conquer Egypt because it needed corn, and Asia Minor because it needed markets for its handicrafts and fortunes for its politicians. A blend of resource acquisition and economic opportunity. He attributes many a battle in British history directly to their insatiable need for Egyptian wheat, Near Eastern oil, and Indian cotton to fuel their industrial empire.
Resources driving empire.
Absolutely. Even Spanish silver explains the wars of Rome with Carthage, and Spanish copper has something to do with German aid to fascist Spain during the Spanish Civil War, linking resource acquisition directly to ideological conflicts. And then he turns a critical eye to America, noting that our sinless selves had a taste for sugar in 1898, implicitly pointing to the economic motivations behind the Spanish-American War.
Oof, yeah. That's a pointed comment.
And in a very pointed, almost prophetic observation, he says that far back in 1853, we pointed our gifts and cannon at a Japanese government and persuaded Japan to transform itself into an industrial nation eager for foreign markets and spoils. These Japanese chickens came home to roost at Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Wow. That's a truly powerful and uncomfortable connection he draws, highlighting how seemingly disparate events can be linked by underlying economic forces. Blowback, essentially.
Yeah, a long historical thread of cause and effect, where past economic pressure, even seemingly benign, leads to devastating future conflict. It suggests a long memory in international relations, where historical actions can reverberate for generations.
And beyond just raw materials and markets, Durant also brings in the business cycle's contribution to modern war. How does economic inequality within a nation, the natural concentration of wealth, play into this tendency towards conflict?
He makes a fascinating and often overlooked observation about the internal dynamics of a society. He observes that because men are by nature unequal, meaning they possess differing abilities, talents, and drives, it naturally follows that in any society, a majority of abilities will be possessed by a minority of men.
Okay, the Pareto principle, sort of.
Kind of, yeah. From this, he states, it follows that sooner or later, in any society, a majority of goods will be possessed by a minority of men. This natural concentration of wealth, however, becomes problematic because it impedes, by the repeated reinvestment of profits and promoting production, widespread purchasing power among the people.
So the rich get richer, reinvest, make more stuff, but regular people can't afford to buy it all.
That's the gist. In simpler terms, when wealth is concentrated at the top and profits are continually reinvested to increase production, the purchasing power of the broader populace often doesn't keep pace. The consequence is that production leaps ahead of consumption.
Surplus, glut.
Exactly. This creates an economic imbalance, leading to a surplus of goods that the domestic market cannot absorb, which in turn can lead to economic depression, unemployment, and severe internal instability. In such a scenario, war can become a desperate, albeit destructive, expedient.
How go?
It can revive flagging trade, stimulate industry, especially arms production, open new foreign markets by force, and perhaps most cynically, distract a discontented populace from internal economic woes by focusing their anger outwards. It's a grim calculus, but one Durant implies has been repeatedly applied throughout history.
The rally round the flag effect, masking economic problems. So economic drives are clearly massive forces, both at the international and domestic level, pushing nations towards conflict. But then there are the political causes. How does Durant summarize the fundamental laws of governments, their inherent nature, that contribute to this persistent cycle of war?
He puts it with chilling succinctness. The first law of governments is self-preservation. Their second law is self-extension.
Simple and stark. Preserve yourself, then grow.
Exactly. He argues that their appetite grows by what it feeds on, meaning that once a state begins to acquire power or territory, the desire for more intensifies. Governments, he asserts, fundamentally believe that when a state ceases to expand, it begins to die. This inherent drive for growth, for dominance, and for self-preservation at all costs creates constant, unavoidable tension in the international arena. It's a relentless, almost biological imperative for states to compete.
And it's not just about active expansion, is it? It's also about the constant, inescapable flux of power among nations, which makes any lasting peace seem incredibly fragile.
Exactly. The distribution of power among nations is always changing. This could be due to a myriad of factors, both internal and external. The discovery or development of new processes or resources, like a new technology or a sudden discovery of oil.
Or AI, maybe, today?
Could be. Or through the rise or decline of population, which can shift demographic and military strength. Or even through the weakening of religion, morals, and character within a society, leading to internal decay. It could also be some other material, biological, or psychological circumstance that subtly or dramatically shifts the balance. When one nation has become strong, it soon asserts itself over the nation that has become weak. This continuous, unpredictable shifting of power makes it incredibly difficult to achieve or maintain lasting peace, because any arrangement is inherently temporary.
Because the ground is always shifting beneath your feet.
Right. He points out the inherent difficulty of writing a peace pact that will perpetuate a present arrangement, a present distribution of power or territory. He even states, with a touch of profound cynicism, wonderful indeed is the treaty that does not generate a war.
Wow. So peace treaties, paradoxically, can sow the very seeds of future conflicts by attempting to freeze a constantly shifting reality. And then Durant delivers one of his most cutting and perhaps most unforgettable conclusions on this entire topic. It's a statement that redefines peace itself.
He does. He states chillingly, peace is war by other means.
Ooh, that hits hard.
It's a profound and deeply cynical summation that suggests that even in periods of ostensible peace, nations are not truly at rest. They are still engaged in a continuous, albeit less violent, struggle for power, for influence, for economic advantage, and for resources.
Using diplomacy, economics, spying.
Exactly. They're simply using different tools than open warfare diplomacy, economic pressure, espionage, technological competition, cultural influence. It implies that conflict, in a broader sense, is a perpetual state of being in international relations. It truly challenges the optimistic notion that peace is merely the absence of war. Instead, it's a continuation of the same fundamental struggle by other, less destructive means. This perspective compels you to look beyond headlines of ceasefires or treaties and consider the ongoing, often subtle, competitions that continue beneath the surface.
Okay, so if this incredibly detailed and often grim analysis is even close to correct, if these forces are so deeply ingrained and persistent, we certainly can't expect quick or easy fixes for the problem of war. Durant then moves into the elusive quest for peace, first by telling us why grand gestures and sweeping ideals often fall short.
Right, he tempers expectations.
He advises us that we must not expect too much from attempts to end or even significantly mitigate war, given the powerful underlying forces at play. He critiques several well-intentioned approaches, starting with what the American philosopher William James called moral equivalence for war. What was James's idea, and why does Durant think it ultimately falls short?
Well, William James, in his characteristically compassionate and optimistic way, hoped that enrolling the nation's youth for a year or two in a far-flung war against nature, he envisioned programs like cutting down forests or building roads in challenging terrain, a conceptual precursor to programs like the Peace Corps, would provide a moral equivalent for war.
Channel that energy into something constructive.
Exactly. The idea was to channel those powerful, innate human impulses for action, adventure, group cohesion, and even mild pugnacity into creative, constructive, and socially beneficial endeavors rather than destructive ones. America, as Durant notes, has indeed tried this with its excellent Peace Corps and similar initiatives.
But Durant's not convinced it's enough.
No. His view is quite sobering. While such measures are undeniably valuable in themselves, helping individuals and communities, they do not reach to the major sources of international strife. They might address some aspects of individual human instinct, but they fundamentally fail to tackle the deeper, systemic, and often brutal causes we've just discussed.
Like group hunger, economic rivalry.
Right. Collective group hunger, relentless economic rivalry for vital resources, or the deep-seated lust for power at a national level. They're simply not powerful enough to counteract the immense forces driving nations to war. Nice idea, but doesn't fix the core issues.
Okay. And he's equally critical, perhaps even more so, of international organizations designed to maintain peace, isn't he? Specifically, he looks at the historical example of the League of Nations.
He is, and his critique is sharp and unsparing. He describes the League of Nations, with certain fleeting exceptions like under the statesmanship of Briand and Stresemann, as essentially a conspiracy of the victors to preserve their gains.
Just the winners trying to lock in their advantage?
That's his take. Its fundamental flaw, he argues, was not malicious intent, but a deep misunderstanding of international dynamics. It had to fail as soon as the fertility and industry of the defeated had altered the balance of national power prescribed by the Treaty of Versailles.
Because the losers, like Germany, rebuilt and got stronger.
Exactly. In other words, it tried to freeze a particular moment in time, the post-World War I distribution of power, and to make immutable a global arrangement that was inherently dynamic, constantly shifting due to population growth, industrial capacity, and technological advancement. Durant states unequivocally, the life of nations cannot be straitjacketed into immutability.
Things change. You can't stop that.
Change is an absolute given, an inherent characteristic of national life. And any system that ignores that fundamental truth, any attempt to permanently entrench a particular power dynamic, is inevitably doomed to fail. It's a powerful argument for the organic, ever-evolving nature of international relations.
And what about pacifism or direct appeals to what some might call the conscience of mankind? He sounds quite skeptical there as well, almost dismissing the power of pure idealism.
Very much so. He observes that pacifism would be a cure for war if it could survive the call to arms and national defense. He cites the famous, almost legendary example of the Oxford Union debate in 1933, where English youth famously vowed never to take up arms for king and country.
A big symbolic moment.
Huge. Yet, when faced with the undeniable existential threat of Nazi aggression, those very same students took them up manfully against Hitler. It's a pragmatic, if disheartening, observation about the limits of idealism and intellectual conviction when confronted with a clear, immediate, and overwhelming threat to national survival.
Idealism melts away when your existence is threatened.
That seems to be his point. It suggests that while pacifism is a noble aspiration, it often struggles to withstand the raw, primal force of self-preservation when a nation perceives itself to be under attack.
So, if individual idealism often fails under pressure, what about a global conscience, a collective moral awakening? Surely that could hold sway.
Durant argues that vague appeals to the conscience of mankind have had little effect throughout history, for there is no conscience of mankind. This is a stark, almost brutal claim.
Yeah, pretty blunt.
And he backs it up with a very clear, sequential line of reasoning that cuts through much of our modern idealism about human nature. Morality is a habit of order generated by centuries of compulsion. International morality awaits international order awaits international force, conscience follows the policeman.
Okay, unpack that. Morality needs enforcement.
His point is that morality, especially on a large scale, isn't an inherent universal feeling that can simply be appealed to. It's a learned behavior, a social construct that historically arises and is enforced by systems of power, by laws, and ultimately by the threat or application of force. Without a global enforcement mechanism, without a global policeman capable of imposing order and consequences, he argues, there can be no true, effective global conscience capable of preventing war.
So no world government, no real-world conscience.
That's the implication. His pragmatic conclusion, therefore, which encapsulates his deep realism, is a wise people will love peace and keep its powder dry. It's a sobering reminder that self-interest and the perpetual need for robust defense remain paramount in an anarchic international system.
So if grand gestures, idealism, and broad international structures as traditionally conceived won't cut it, what is an effective pragmatic approach to the seemingly intractable problem of war, according to Durant? He talks about specificity and patient adjustment of specific causes. This sounds like a radically different approach.
This is where Durant pivots from his critiques of what doesn't work to a realistic, actionable, albeit painstaking path forward. He argues that an effective approach will proceed not by large and generous emotions, not by grand declarations, but by the specific study and patient adjustment of specific causes and disputes.
Get down to the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. His call is for peace to be planned and organized as realistically as war, meaning with provision for every factor and prevision for every detail. This isn't a task for occasional moments stolen by busy statesmen from internal affairs, he stresses. It requires the full-time attention of first-rate minds. Minds as dedicated and rigorous as those planning military campaigns.
That's a crucial and often overlooked point. Treating peace building with the same rigor, dedication, and meticulous planning as we typically apply to war planning. And he suggests a very detailed, practical mechanism for this, involving international commissions.
Exactly. He believes that because the incentives to war are so numerous and powerful, each of them should be the major concern of an international commission specifically appointed for its consideration and adjustments. He even quips about the number of specialists, economists, and diplomats lying around who could be put to such vital work.
Put the experts to work on specific problems.
Right. These commissions, he envisions, would be tasked to examine the economic causes of war, to hear the disputing groups patiently, to investigate possibilities of conciliation, to make specific and practicable recommendations to their governments. They would be problem solvers, not grandstanding politicians.
And a key component of this process, which is very interesting, is that it should be done without the explosive excitement of publicity. That feels almost counterintuitive in our modern media-saturated world.
That's a critical and perhaps radical detail, especially from a 20th century perspective. The goal, as he sees it, is to isolate the germs of war at their source and sterilize them with understanding and negotiation.
Work quietly behind the scenes.
He clearly believes that public grandstanding, political theater, and the inevitable emotionalism stirred by media attention often inflame rather than resolve international disputes. By operating quietly, dispassionately, and behind closed doors, these commissions could address core issues directly and rationally, away from the glare of public opinion or nationalist fervor. He even offers specific, concrete examples of the types of commissions he envisions tackling these underlying causes.
Like one to specifically address problems related to human fertility and population growth?
Yes, he suggests one such commission would study the problems generated by reckless human fertility. Its direct, pragmatic role would be to promote policies and methods of family limitation wherever the birth rate, minus the death rate is, exceeding a sustainable level, thus alleviating the group hunger and pressure for resources that he identified as a biological root of war.
To tackle population pressure head-on.
And another commission would focus on the immense economic drivers, access to raw materials and markets, suggesting mechanisms for fair distribution or managed trade to reduce competitive friction. He even suggests that it should be a major function of the Department of State to wage peace vigorously and continuously on every front, elevating peacemaking from a reactive, intermittent activity to a constant, active pursuit, managed with the same strategic intensity as national defense. It's a vision of perpetual professional peace-building.
So, a pragmatic, unromantic, but persistent effort on all fronts, driven by specialists and a deep understanding of the specific triggers of conflict. This really ties back to his initial realism about human nature and the powerful, ingrained forces that drive conflict, suggesting that the path to peace is less about transforming human nature and more about managing its inherent tendencies.
I think that's a fair summary.
In the end, what is Durant's concluding philosophy on all of this? How does he sum up this lifelong quest for peace, given the incredibly challenging picture he has painted?
He encourages us and perhaps cautions us to steel ourselves against utopias and be content, as Aristotle recommended, with a slightly better state. It's a profound call for realism, a rejection of naive idealism, and an acceptance that perfect perpetual peace may be an unattainable human dream.
Don't expect miracles.
Right. However, it simultaneously implies that incremental improvements, a slightly better state than what came before, are not only possible, but entirely worthy of our sustained, dedicated effort. He then brings it back to individual responsibility, stating, "We must not expect the world to improve much faster than ourselves." This suggests that any lasting, meaningful change in the global landscape must ultimately begin with personal growth, individual understanding, and the cultivation of empathy within each of us.
So the burden is, in part, on each of us to contribute to this slightly better state. And he gives us a vision, a path for how we might, as individuals, contribute to this broader understanding and perhaps to a more peaceful world.
Yes, he offers a surprisingly hopeful path for mitigation, for softening the sharp edges of conflict. Perhaps if we can broaden our borders with intelligent study, impartial histories, modest travel, and honest thought, if we can become conscious of the needs and views and hopes of other peoples, and sensitive to the diverse values and beauties of diverse cultures and lands.
Through learning and experience.
Exactly. The desired outcome, as he envisions it, is not a naive eradication of all differences, but a fundamental shift in perspective. Becoming so aware and appreciative of others that we shall not so readily plunge into competitive homicide, but shall find room in our hearts for a wider understanding and an almost universal sympathy. It's a cultivation of wisdom through exposure and reflection.
What a beautiful and profound sentiment, especially considering all the stark and often grim realities he lays out about human nature and the forces that drive conflict. It's a powerful counterpoint to the earlier pessimism.
It is, and it serves as his ultimate hopeful challenge. He concludes by saying, "We shall find in all nations qualities and accomplishments from which we may learn and refresh ourselves, and by which we may enrich our inheritance and our posterity." It's a vision where understanding, appreciation, and even admiration for other cultures and their achievements can gradually replace the fear, suspicion, and aggressive competition that so often lead to conflict. It's a quiet argument for the transformative power of empathy and knowledge.
And to leave you with one final, poignant thought from Will Durant's Fallen Leaves, a wish that resonates deeply, particularly after this deep dive into the nature of war and peace. Someday, let us hope, it will be permitted us to love our country without betraying mankind. End quote. What does that simple yet profound sentence mean to you? What personal actions or shifts in perspective might contribute to that possibility, where loyalty to one's own group doesn't necessitate hostility towards others? How might a deeper understanding of war's intricate and often uncomfortable causes allow us to better appreciate and nurture the hidden gold of peace in our own lives and communities, in a way that respects both our innate drives and our highest aspirations for a more harmonious world?